It always starts with something small. Something so casual, so easy to overlook, that most people don't even realize what they've just heard until it's already too late. A light laugh. Relaxed tone. A simple answer to a fan's question. Nothing about the moment feels dangerous. Nothing feels explosive. And yet buried inside that calm delivery is a sentence that quietly detonates everything. Because when Mykelti Brown Padron speaks about what TLC told her, she doesn't pause for dramatic effect. She doesn't lower her voice. She doesn't signal that what she's about to say will change how you see the last 15 years. She just says it. Plain. Direct. Almost like it's nothing. And that's exactly why it hits so hard. The network told her that if she and her husband decided to live plural marriage, they could probably have their own spinoff. Just like that. No build-up. No hesitation. Just a condition disguised as an opportunity. And if you're really paying attention, that's the moment everything shifts, because that one sentence doesn't just reveal an offer, it reveals a mindset. For years, audiences believed they were watching reality unfold naturally. That was the entire appeal of Sister Wives. It wasn't supposed to feel scripted or manufactured. It was supposed to feel real, raw, honest. A family opening their lives to the world to show that something widely misunderstood could actually work. That was the foundation. That was the promise. And for a long time people bought into it. They watched the interactions, the shared spaces, the laughter between siblings, the complicated but seemingly functional relationships. And they thought maybe, just maybe, this lifestyle wasn't what they had assumed it to be. Maybe it was sustainable. Maybe it was fulfilling. Maybe it worked. But here's the part that starts to unravel everything. If it really worked, if it truly created something strong and lasting, then why did every single person raised inside it walk away? Teen children. Not 2, not 5, not even a majority. All 18. Each one growing up inside the same system, hearing the same beliefs, watching the same dynamics play out day after day, year after year. And when they reached the point where they could choose their own lives, they didn't hesitate. They didn't continue the tradition. They didn't carry the torch. They didn't even try to replicate what they had seen. They rejected it. Completely. And not quietly either. These weren't hidden decisions made away from the public eye. These were choices made openly, sometimes even on camera, in front of millions of viewers who had spent years watching their lives unfold. Think about what that means. Think about how powerful that pattern is. Because when a system produces 18 individuals who all decide it's not for them, that's not a coincidence. That's evidence. And this is where the discomfort starts to creep in, because it forces a question that the show was never designed to answer. What if the reality being presented wasn't the full picture? What if what people saw was only part of the story, carefully framed, carefully edited, carefully guided in a direction that served a larger purpose? Because once you consider that possibility, once you allow yourself to think that maybe things weren't as organic as they seemed, every moment begins to feel different. Every argument, every emotional breakdown, every carefully timed revelation, it all starts to carry a different weight. And suddenly, Mykelti's comment isn't just a random behind-the-scenes detail. Becomes a key. A piece of information that unlocks a much bigger understanding of how things might have actually worked. 'Cause look at the timing. Look at what was happening to the show as the years went on. The children were growing up. They were developing their own identities, their own perspectives, their own understanding of the world beyond what they had been taught. And as they did, they started making choices that didn't align with the original narrative. They chose monogamy. They chose independence. They chose distance from the very lifestyle the show was built around. And with each of those choices, the foundation of the show started to weaken. Because if the next generation wasn't continuing the lifestyle, then what was the future of the story? What was left to show? Where could it go next? That's the problem no one talks about, but it's the one that changes everything. Reality television depends on continuity. It depends on evolution. It needs something to build toward, something to keep viewers invested. And when the core concept of a show starts to collapse, the pressure to maintain it becomes intense. 'Cause it's not just about storytelling anymore. It's about survival. It's about keeping an audience engaged, keeping ratings steady, keeping a franchise alive. And when reality doesn't provide what's needed, that's when things can start to shift in ways the audience never sees. So when Mykelti says that the network told her she could have a spinoff if she decided to live plural marriage, it doesn't exist in isolation. Connects to that pressure. It connects to that need to keep the narrative going. Because what the network was facing was a reality they couldn't easily work with. A family that no longer represented the message they originally set out to promote. A next generation that had completely rejected the premise. And in that moment, the question becomes unavoidable. If reality no longer supports the story, do you change the story? Or do you try to influence reality? That's where the line begins to blur. Because on the surface, the offer sounds simple. Conditional, yes, but still an offer. Possibility. A door that could open under the right circumstances. But when you look closer, when you really break it down, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a suggestion that a deeply personal life decision could be shaped, influenced, even incentivized by external factors. And that's not something you can ignore. Because choosing how you live your life, choosing whether or not to enter a plural marriage, isn't a small decision. It's not something you take lightly. It affects relationships, emotions, identity, stability. Changes everything. And when that kind of decision is placed next to the possibility of a television show, of exposure, of opportunity, it creates a tension that's impossible to overlook. What makes it even more unsettling is how casually it was revealed. There was no outrage in Mykelti's voice. No dramatic pause. No sense that she was exposing something shocking. She just said it. Like it was normal. Like it was something that didn't need to be questioned. And maybe that's the most revealing part of all. Because it suggests that this wasn't some isolated, unbelievable moment. It suggests that this kind of conversation might have been more common than anyone realized. That behind the scenes, there were discussions happening that the audience never heard, decisions being considered that never made it to the screen, influences being applied in ways that weren't visible. The moment you start thinking about it deeply, it stops feeling like a simple offer and starts feeling like something much more calculated, much more deliberate, and honestly, much more unsettling than anyone wants to admit. Because imagine standing in that position, not as a viewer watching from the outside, but as someone who lived every second of it. Someone who grew up inside the system, who didn't just hear about plural marriage but experienced it in real time, in real emotions, in real relationships that were far more complicated than anything a camera could fully capture. And now, after years of watching those dynamics unfold, after seeing the imbalance, the tension, the quiet disappointments that never quite made it into the final edit, you reach a point where you finally understand what it all means for you. You make a decision. Clear one. This isn't the life you want. Not because you hate your family, not because you reject where you came from, but because you've seen enough to know that it's not the future you're willing to build. And just when you settle into that clarity, just when you start creating something different for yourself, someone steps in and places a possibility right in front of you. Not aggressively, not forcefully, but carefully, strategically. If you chose differently, things could open up for you. That's where the real tension begins to build, because this isn't just about television anymore. This is about influence, about the subtle ways in which external forces can start to shape internal decisions. And the most powerful part of it is that it doesn't look like pressure on the surface. It looks like opportunity. It looks like a door being opened. But what sits behind that door is a condition, and that condition changes everything. Because now the decision isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a space where personal identity, family history, emotional experience, and potential reward are all colliding at the same time. And when those things collide, the outcome becomes something far more complicated than a simple yes or no. When Mykelti Brown Padron shared that the offer was tied to a lifestyle choice, she didn't present it as shocking, and that's exactly what makes it so powerful. Because it suggests that, to her, this kind of conversation didn't feel out of place. It didn't feel like something extraordinary. It felt like something that could happen. And if it could happen once, then it raises a question that's impossible to ignore. How many times did it happen? How many moments like this existed just outside the frame, just beyond what the audience was allowed to see? Because the truth is, what viewers experience is always a version of reality, not the entirety of it. It's edited, structured, shaped into something that tells a story. And when a story needs to continue, when it needs to evolve, there are always forces working behind the scenes to make sure it does. Think about what was at stake at that point in time. The children were no longer children. They were adults with their own lives, their own partners, their own perspectives that didn't necessarily align with what had been presented for years. The central idea that once held everything together was slipping. The narrative that had driven the show forward was losing its foundation. Because the entire premise depended on one thing continuing: plural marriage. And when that continuation disappeared, it didn't just create a gap, created a void. A void that needed to be filled if the story was going to survive. This is where the situation becomes more than just a behind-the-scenes detail. It becomes a reflection of how reality television operates at its core. Because no matter how real something appears, there is always a layer of intention behind it. There are decisions about what to show, what to emphasize, what to revisit, and sometimes what to encourage. And encouragement doesn't always look like direction. It can be subtle. It can be wrapped in suggestion, in possibility, in the idea that something could happen if the circumstances were right. And when you place that kind of suggestion in front of someone whose life has already been shaped by years of public exposure, it carries a weight that's hard to measure. Now take a step back and think about what that means for the audience. For years, people watched Sister Wives believing they were seeing a family navigate life as it happened. They saw the highs, the lows, the emotional conversations, the conflicts that seemed raw and unscripted. And to some extent those moments were real. The emotions were real. The experiences were real. But the context around them, the way they were framed, the direction they were taken in, that's where things become less certain. Because if there were moments where reality was being nudged in a particular direction, even slightly, then it changes how those scenes are understood. And this is where the psychological aspect becomes impossible to ignore. Because when you grow up in an environment where your life is constantly being observed, where moments are being captured, edited, and presented to an audience, it begins to shape how you see yourself. It begins to influence how you interpret your own experiences. And over time, that influence can become so normalized that it's hard to separate what is entirely your own choice from what might have been subtly guided along the way. That's not something most viewers think about, but it's something that becomes very real for the people living inside that environment. Which brings us back to the decision. The moment where Mykelti could have chosen to step into that opportunity. Because from the outside it might seem simple. A show, visibility, a continuation of something familiar. But from the inside it's not simple at all. It's a crossroads. One path leads back into a system that she had already decided wasn't right for her. The other leads forward into something unknown but authentic. And the fact that she chose the second path tells you everything you need to know about how deeply those earlier experiences must have impacted her. But what makes this even more compelling is that her decision wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. Because in saying no, she didn't just reject an offer. She rejected the continuation of a narrative that no longer reflected her reality. And in doing so, she exposed something that had been sitting just beneath the surface for years. The idea that the story might not have been evolving naturally, but instead being held together by whatever means necessary. And once that idea takes hold, it changes how you see everything that follows. Because now you're not just watching events unfold, you're analyzing them. You're questioning them. You're looking at each moment and asking whether it happened the way it did because that's how life naturally progressed, or because it served a purpose within a larger narrative. And that kind of awareness is difficult to reverse. By the time everything begins to visibly fall apart, it doesn't happen all at once. There's no single moment where everything collapses in front of the audience like a dramatic finale. Instead, it's slower than that, quieter, almost unnoticeable at first. A shift in tone, change in energy, conversations that feel heavier than they used to, smiles that don't last as long, laughter that sounds slightly forced. And if you've been watching closely, if you've been paying attention to the small details instead of just the big moments, you start to feel it before you can fully explain it. Something is different. Something is off. And that feeling only grows stronger with time. Because what once felt like a functioning, if unconventional, family dynamics slowly starts to reveal cracks that were always there, but are now impossible to hide. At the center of it all is Mykelti Brown, a figure who was originally presented as the structure holding everything together, the one balancing multiple relationships, multiple households, multiple emotional responsibilities. That was the image. That was the idea the audience was introduced to. But as the years went on, that balance started to look less like strength and more like strain. Time wasn't being divided equally. Attention wasn't being shared fairly. And the emotional weight of maintaining that system began to show in ways that couldn't be edited out completely. Because no matter how carefully something is presented, reality has a way of leaking through. And the people who felt it most weren't just the wives. They were the children. The ones who grew up watching these dynamics play out day after day. Not as a storyline, but as their actual lives. They saw who showed up and who didn't. They noticed who received attention and who was left waiting. They experienced the difference between what was said on camera and what happened behind it. And over time, those observations turned into understanding. A kind of understanding that doesn't come from being told something, but from living it. From feeling it. From recognizing patterns that repeat over and over again until they become impossible to ignore. That's why their decisions carry so much weight. Because when every single one of them chooses a different path, it's not random. It's not coincidence. It's a response. A collective, unspoken conclusion drawn from years of shared experience. And that's the part that quietly dismantles the original premise of Sister Wives. Because the show wasn't just about one family. It was about an idea. An idea that this lifestyle could work, that it could create something stable, something fulfilling, something worth understanding. But when the very people raised inside that idea walk away from it, it forces a question that the show was never built to answer. What if the idea doesn't hold up under real life? And that's where the tension between narrative and reality becomes impossible to ignore. Because at this point the show has two options. It can follow reality wherever it leads, even if that means moving away from its original purpose. Or it can try to hold on to that purpose, even if reality is no longer supporting it. And based on what Mykelti Brown Padron revealed, it starts to feel like the second option may have been considered more seriously than anyone realized. 'Cause think about the timing again. The children are grown. The next generation has made its choices. The central concept is no longer evolving in the way it once did. And at the same time, the show still exists. Still needs content. Still needs direction. Still needs something to keep it moving forward. And when the natural progression of the story slows down or shifts away from what made it successful, there's always a temptation to guide it back. To find ways to reintroduce the elements that originally drew people in. To recreate the conditions that made the story work in the first place. But here's where it becomes complicated, because you can't simply recreate reality. You can't force people to live in a way they've already chosen to leave behind. You can't make them believe in something they've already questioned. And yet, if there are incentives placed in front of them, if there are opportunities tied to certain choices, it creates a scenario where reality doesn't have to be forced, it just has to be influenced enough to move in a particular direction. And that's the space where things start to feel less like observation and more like intervention. At the same time, the show itself begins to change. The focus shifts away from the broader idea of plural marriage working as a system and moves toward the fractures within it. The arguments become more central. The emotional conflicts take center stage. The relationships that once appeared stable begin to show signs of breaking down. And while this might seem like a natural evolution, it also serves another purpose. Because conflict keeps people watching. Conflict creates engagement. Conflict fills the space that's left when the original narrative starts to fade. And this is where the audience finds itself in a strange position. Because on one hand, they're watching something that feels undeniably real. Real emotions, real pain, real consequences. But on the other hand, they're beginning to question how much of what they're seeing is being shaped, emphasized, or even encouraged to create a more compelling story. And that uncertainty changes the viewing experience entirely. Because now it's not just about what happens, it's about why it happens the way it does. Meanwhile, the individuals at the center of it all are still living their lives. They're still navigating relationships, making decisions, dealing with the same challenges they always have. But now those experiences exist in a space where they're not only personal, they're also part of a larger narrative that needs to continue. And that creates a kind of pressure that's difficult to fully understand from the outside. 'Cause it's not direct. It's not always obvious. But it's there, influencing how situations are approached, how conversations unfold, how choices are framed. And through all of this, the children continue to move further away from the original premise. They build lives that look nothing like what they grew up with. They create relationships based on entirely different expectations. They prioritize stability, equality, and clarity in ways that reflect what they didn't experience. And in doing so, they reinforce the same message over and over again without ever needing to say it directly. This is not the path they're choosing. This is not the system they believe in. This is not the life they want. That consistency becomes impossible to ignore. Because it's not just one perspective, it's all of them. Different personalities, different experiences, different relationships, all arriving at the same conclusion. And when that happens, it doesn't just challenge the narrative, it replaces it. By the time you reach the end of it all, there's no dramatic announcement telling you that everything you thought you understood has changed. There's no single scene where someone turns to the camera and explains the truth in a way that neatly ties everything together. Instead, it's something far quieter, far more unsettling. It's a realization that builds slowly, piece by piece, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Because once you've seen the pattern, once you've connected the moments, once you've listened carefully to what was said and, more importantly, how it was said, you can't go back to seeing the story the same way again. And that's what makes this final layer so powerful. Not that it shocks you all at once, but that it stays with you, reshaping everything you thought you knew about Sister Wives long after the screen goes dark. Because in the end, this was never just about one offer. It was never just about one conversation or one possibility that was placed in front of Mykelti Brown Padron and quietly declined. It was about what that offer represented. What it revealed about the priorities behind the scenes. What it suggested about the lengths that might be considered when a narrative begins to slip out of control. And when you look at it from that perspective, the story becomes something much bigger than it first appeared. It becomes a reflection of how easily the line between reality and entertainment can begin to blur when there's something at stake. 'Cause make no mistake, there was something at stake. This wasn't just a show. It was a long-running narrative built around a specific idea. An idea that needed to hold together for the story to continue. And when that idea started to weaken, when the very people who were supposed to carry it forward chose not to, it created a kind of tension that couldn't be ignored. A tension between what was real and what was expected. Between the direction life was naturally moving and the direction the story needed it to go. And in that space, where those two forces collide, decisions begin to take on a different weight. That's where the significance of refusal becomes clear. Because when Mykelti said no, it wasn't just a personal decision. It was a break in the pattern. A moment where reality refused to be shaped, refused to be redirected,